Good evening, everyone. I'm going to do the shh that always works really well. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kate Gilbert. I'm the Executive Director of the Boston Public Art Triennial. I want to take a few minutes to welcome you to tonight's event, which is made possible through our partnership with Catalyst Conversations and the City of Boston. This conversation will center on topics across nature, power, and colonization. And it's exactly the type of unique, provocative, and expansive discussions that we hope to have when we created the triennial and the theme of the exchange. Tonight, both through the examination of invasive species and human species, both of their propensities for invasion, we also acknowledge the atrocities of colonization across the Americas, and particularly in New England. Adela's piece, which I hope all of you had a chance to visit out in the plaza, invites us to build on that collective recognition of colonial violence and creating a transformative and healing experience with other post-colonial cultures across the Americas. I hope many of you will join us as we culminate this conversation about invasive plant species, hybridization, and survival with Adela's performance next Friday, the 12th, here on City Hall Plaza at 7 p.m. I'm sure we'll hear much more about it as we go on this conversation. So it is my distinct pleasure to invite up Deborah Davidson, the founder and now artistic director of Catalyst Conversations.
Change of glasses. Thank you, Kate. So glad that you're here, and thank you for your... Okay, better? Oh, okay. Okay, hello everyone. As you all know, I'm Deborah Davidson, founder and artistic director of Catalyst Conversations, and I am very happy to welcome you tonight to a Catalyst Conversation. I want to thank the Boston Public Art Triennial for presenting this conversation with us. I would especially like to extend thanks to Marguerite. Okay. Marguerite Winter and her team for making everything go smoothly as we plan this program. I'd also like to thank City of Boston Arts and Culture for hosting our program here on the mezzanine this evening. Thanks also to the Cambridge Arts Council, our founding partner, our board, and all our volunteers who help us out, and to those of you who have donated recently to us. I would like to note a few of the recent changes at Catalyst. Our esteemed board member, Jill Slosburg-Ackerman, is stepping down, and Jill is co-curator of this program, and she'll be moderating the conversation. In January, we welcomed Alberta Chu as our executive director. Alberta amplifies the intersections of science and art through storytelling, events, and public programs to inspire innovation, connection, and inclusive communities. Catalyst Conversations was founded in... Oh dear. Okay, is that okay? Better? Sorry, everyone. We were founded in 2012 to open a critical path for dialogue between the arts and sciences. We present intimate and provocative conversations between artists and scientists and the public. We are interested in the connection between the two through programs, educational outreach, and synergy between art and science. This evening, Triennial artist Adela Goldbard is in conversation with evolutionary biologist LaScaleia and Charles Davis, professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. And we are pleased that the Triennial Curator, Tess Lukey, will also join the discussion. The topic, as you've heard, is Transformative Invasions. And there are many definitions of invasion: invasive, species, colonialism, and the usurping of power. How does an artistic approach and a scientific approach both work to mitigate the effect of what harms the culture? Our speakers come at this idea of invasive and native species from different lenses, allowing us to experience Goldbard's sculpture in a new and exciting way. An interdisciplinary artist scholar based in Rhode Island and Mexico City, Adela creates politically charged collaborative works that culminate in the burning of large-scale effigies. LaScaleia works to determine why our native New England caterpillars are failing to control populations of invasive exotic plants. Charles Davis's research focuses on plant diversity, integrating the disciplines of systematics, paleobiology, evolution, ecology, and molecular biology. One major theme that unites these disciplines is the phylogenetic theory, which is applied to reconstruct the history of plant diversity through evolutionary time. Tess Lukey is the trustee's first ever associate curator of Native American art to develop exhibitions and research initiatives related to the trustee's indigenous art collection. She is enrolled citizen of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, Aquina. So each speaker will present for 15 minutes. Okay. This is my last sentence. Okay, anyway, our speakers will each speak for 15 minutes and then gather with Jill for the conversation. So with that, we have Michael LaScaleia.
Alrighty, let's see. I'm going to get this right up there. Everybody able to hear me? Okay. All right. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about invasive plants and native controls. First, just a quick background on myself. I'm the Catherine H. Putnam Fellow at the Arnold Arboretum. This is a position that's a postdoctoral position. I've been at it for a year, so this work is still in a bit of its early stages, but I'm going to walk you through some of what I'm doing. And so to start off, I want to introduce you all to an invasive species that you might know. This is tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima. You will see this plant pretty much everywhere in the city. You'll see it growing out of sidewalks. You'll especially see it on the highway. It is capable of growing everywhere. This is a plant that was introduced to the United States several different times from East Asia. So it was introduced at least once to Pennsylvania, at least once to Virginia in the early 1800s, but has probably been introduced a number of times. And this is a plant that has become a particular concern of very recently because it is also the primary host for the spotted lanternfly, which is another invasive insect, another invasive species, an insect this time, that was introduced to the Maryland area and has rapidly spread and does significant damage to agricultural places as well as our native trees. So this is something that is a big concern. So why does Tree of Heaven succeed? Well, it is disturbance tolerant. It can grow in areas with high salt, high heavy metals, all sorts of different environments. It is fast growing. You will not find a faster growing tree. And because it's fast growing, it also tends to fall over a lot and drop branches on cars a lot and just do a lot of very undesirable things for trees. And additionally, it is released from its enemies. What exactly does that mean, enemy release? That is what I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of my time talking about. So the enemy release hypothesis is this idea that invasive exotic plants experience significantly less herbivory in their invading range, in this case New England, than they do in their native range. And we can see this based on the caterpillars that specialize on Tree of Heaven. These are caterpillars that only eat Tree of Heaven and don't eat any other plants. And in their native range, they have a large number of caterpillars. They've got a big silk moth, Atticus atlas. They've got little things like Elegma narcissus, and they've just got a number of different caterpillar species that only eat Tree of Heaven. And in New England, we have nothing. And there's an asterisk there, and we'll definitely be getting to that asterisk. But for now, there is nothing that is native to New England that specializes on eating Tree of Heaven. And therefore, it is released from its enemies. Its enemies aren't able to control its population, and its population is able to grow unbounded. Oops, sorry, I didn't put up the none with the asterisk. My bad. All right, so this immediately raises a question. Why don't we just go to East Asia, grab one of these caterpillar species, and bring it into New England so that way it eats Tree of Heaven? And I will tell you, introduced biocontrols can be great. In fact, they are probably the best method that we have for controlling the populations of introduced plant species. To give you an example, we have another common invasive plant species here in New England. This is purple loosestrife, and this will take over swampy areas. It's very pretty, so you'll look out over a swamp and you'll say, oh, it's all purple, it's all beautiful, but it is truly choked of all of its biodiversity by this one plant. In the late 80s and early 90s, this species of beetle was introduced from Eurasia, where purple loosestrife is from, and it did a very good job of controlling the purple loosestrife population. And I want to note that controlling is not eliminating. You can absolutely still find purple loosestrife in the New England landscape, but it doesn't quite choke out the native biodiversity like it used to, since it now has an enemy. So with all that being said about introduced biocontrols, they can also be disastrous. They are by far the most effective way we have at controlling invasive plant species. They are also by far the most dangerous way that we have of controlling invasive plant species. Here I want to give an example not of controlling an invasive plant species, but in controlling an invasive pest. So the black pecan aphid was accidentally introduced in Louisiana in the 1800s, and in order to control the black pecan aphid on their orchards, plantation owners brought in the Asiatic lady beetle, which ate absolutely everything. If you go outside and find a ladybug outside nowadays, chances are it's likely an Asiatic lady beetle. If you find a ladybug inside your house, it's all but guaranteed to be an Asiatic lady beetle. These things are absolutely everywhere, and they eat invasive aphids, they eat native aphids, they eat everything, and they have been a biological disaster. So, if non-native biocontrols are so dangerous, is there a way that we can get the benefit of a biocontrol without having to introduce it? And here's where that asterisk comes in. We do actually have one caterpillar here in New England that specializes on eating tree of heaven. Is it native? We'll get to that in a second. But it is here naturally, and that is Ativa aurea. I'm giving the scientific name. This is one of those caterpillars that is so unknown broadly that it doesn't have a great common name. People will call it the Ailanthus webworm moth, which isn't particularly descriptive, so I tend to use Ativa aurea. So let's talk about the perks of native biocontrols. There are no off-target effects. We know that this caterpillar eats tree of heaven in New England and only eats tree of heaven in New England. And that is because it is already present on the landscape. We can go out and we can see they're not on oaks, they're not on maples, they're not on sumac, they are just on tree of heaven, which is great. And then finally, they don't work. Sorry, that's a bad thing. This is an unfortunate thing. If they were working, tree of heaven wouldn't be an invasive species. It would be a well-controlled species. It's already here. It's not controlling them. And this is true if you go out and go into a sidewalk crack and you'll find a tree of heaven growing out of it. And chances are it will look like this one with no herbivory on it whatsoever, not an Ativa aurea in sight. And so we've now gotten to the crux of what my research is. It is simply asking the big but simple question, why not? Why don't they work? It kind of feels like it should work if they're here and they're only eating tree of heaven. Why aren't they controlling the population? So to start off with this question, let's give a little bit of background on being a caterpillar. It's awful to be a caterpillar. Even caterpillars don't want to be caterpillars. Let's talk about why. So the life cycle that you might have learned of a caterpillar is that it goes from being a caterpillar to a pupa, and then in this case, to a moth. And while they're doing that, they are being attacked by birds. Now, generally, they're being attacked by birds more so when they're caterpillars than when they are moths. And so they want to be a caterpillar for as short a time as possible in order to prioritize getting to that stage where they can actually avoid predation. But it's actually worse than this. Caterpillars go from being small caterpillars through different stages called instars to being bigger and bigger, and then they pupate, and then they're moths. And they are being attacked by all sorts of different things while they're in this stage. And then additionally, if they don't get enough energy from the plant that they're eating at each stage, they aren't able to transition to that next stage, and they asphyxiate. So there really is just no winning if you're a caterpillar, and they're forced to eat Tree of Heaven, which is kind of a bad plant. On top of that, let's look at Ativa aurea's actual native host plant, the Florida corkwood. The native range of the Florida corkwood, the plant that it eats in the Americas, is this, which I'll tell you is nowhere near New England. This is an animal that is used to eating in the warm Georgia subtropics, not in New England. And so you add this extra layer of temperature and seasonality and humidity, and it just becomes terrible. So, getting into my work is to try and figure out exactly how invasive plants are succeeding in New England, determine what is exactly suppressing our native caterpillars, and helping those caterpillars to succeed. So my study system at the Arboretum is a great study system. I've taken 7 plant families that have an invasive plant species that's doing damage, a native plant species, and a specialist caterpillar that eats those families, that specializes on those families, in addition to a number of different species that are what I call non-invasive exotics. These are species that provide us with an example of an unsuccessful invasion. For example, Japanese barberry invaded. This other species of barberry, Berberis cratagenia, didn't. And so what is the difference between those two? And with each of those, I'm finding what their defenses are. So with the help of my lovely interns at the Arboretum, I'm able to look at the chemical defenses, which are just a whole bunch of different methods that just look at the chemistry within the leaves that protect them from caterpillars, and the physical defenses, what physically makes it difficult for a caterpillar to chew on. And then for steps 2 and 3, helping those caterpillars overcome their difficulties, I am rearing colonies of caterpillars. I currently have 3 species, Ativa aurea that eats Tree of Heaven, Rhomaptera medii that eats Japanese barberry, and Eponemuta multipunctella that eats flamebush, hoping to get the other 4 species of caterpillar that I've been looking for. So with this research, I hope to move us closer to a safer, easier, and more effective way to control our dangerous invasive plant species. Thank you all very much for listening.
So hi everyone, can you listen to me okay? Yeah. Thank you everyone for being here. So I named my talk today, Phragmites and Totora, a shared history of craft as cultural resistance. And just a disclaimer, I'm not a scientist, I'm an artist, so all of this research comes actually from artistic research, right? So aesthetic research and going to the places and actually dealing with the materials, which is what artists kind of do. So Totora, right? So Totora, it was difficult for me, and please, the scientists in this panel will help me out, later. So the Totora, it's difficult to pin the actual classification because there's actually like a kind of common traits with bulrush. So sometimes they put them together, sometimes they find them as separate. But the important thing for me, for the Totora, is not only its scientific classification, but their uses, right? So Totora, which grows mainly in the Lake Titicaca, which is both part of Peru and both part of Bolivia, has been used for many, many centuries. Some people say that it's been 3,000 years that they use Totora to actually build, right? So the main things that they build is boats, but they have also been using Totora to build the actual islands, right? The floating islands. So as you can see here, these islands, the ground that they're like actually like where these houses are built, and the houses are also mainly built of Totora, are part of, the floating devices are also made of Totora. And why is this? Because the Totora has a sponge inside of, I'm probably describing this like totally wrong in terms of scientific research, but bear with me. So they have like a sponge inside, which is a floating device, right? So that allows the Totora to actually build floating islands and also boats like the ones I'm going to show next, right? So this is a classic Totora boat made in Lake Titicaca. So these are all pictures, still pictures from videos that I took last year in one of my research trips, because I was doing a film in Peru, and then we decided to go to the Titicaca and then to Bolivia to do this research. So this is how they harvest totora. So you need to go on another boat and you need to cut it from the marshes. And then this is how they dry it out, in this kind of like vertical kind of like constructions. And this is how they do twining with so it's not really like weaving, this is more like twining because they're very like fragile. So even if they're green or if they're like dried out, you usually need to kind of make bunches with them, and these become like floating devices, right? And then you build up, and they end up with something that can be as complex as this, which is a balsa, which is the Spanish name for a small boat. So totora wining has provided a mode of cultural resistance and survival. It's also something that I have to mention is that Lake Titicaca is the highest, in altitude lake in the world, right? So this is 12,000 feet. I had to look for the feet conversion. This is like more than 3,000 meters. And this is a way of also, for the people of Uros, which are the people that have built these floating islands, and also for the Aymara people in that region, this has become also a way of cultural survival, and even not only cultural, but also survival in general, right? Because for what these people told me when I was there doing research, this has been an ancestral way of kind of avoiding the invasions from the mainland, right? They just go away into their floating islands, and that's a way of hiding, let's say, from invasions that have gone from the Aymara to the Quechua to the Spanish, and there's a long chain of oppressions. So now this is a kind of comparison, right? So this is the common reed. This is a marsh in. So the common reed is it's very different kind of species. It's not really related to the totora. These are Phragmites, which is a completely different kind of, it's a different family. This is a grass species. And according to my research, because I've been working a lot with Phragmites, the Phragmites have both native and non-native species to the Americas, right? So the non-native species, let's say the invasive species, the research has showed that it came in the hulls of colonial boats, right? So these invasive species has expanded all over the Americas and has made other native species to kind of be like, they just thrive and they just get rid of the native species. So this has happened both in New England. This is marshes in New England, in Barrington specifically, of Phragmites. And so we went on collecting Phragmites from these marshes for the project, because although the Phragmites and the totora are not connected, let's say, scientifically, I find that there's a connection because of the use, right? Because of the technologies, let's say, native technologies that have been applied to these species, although some of them are not native, right? So we went on a trip to collect these Rhode Island Phragmites, which are the same that grow here in Boston. And I have to acknowledge my collaborator, Aymar Kopakati, who's actually sitting right there, who introduced me to this research about how the native Phragmites from Rhode Island and Massachusetts area could be used in a similar way to the totora in Lake Titicaca, where he's originally from, right? So this is work from him. He's been, as you can see, going back to the other slides, this is how they dry them out, right? So this is a sculpture that he made, considering that shape, right? So this is a formal, let's say, connection between the Phragmites and the totora. But then he also went ahead and built an actual totora boat, but with Phragmites, right? So in order to make these totora also floating devices, he had to use plastic to put it inside. Because the Phragmites, as you can see in this picture, maybe you can't really see it, but they're like buoyed from inside, right? So they're not necessarily like floating devices as the other ones, which are like sponge-like. But it's very interesting for me as an artist to see that, these shapes can be achieved with both the Phragmites and the totora. So I see like a connection that's not really scientific, but there's a connection that is cultural, right? And there's a connection that is formal, so there's a connection that's aesthetic at the end. So we went on with a group of friends collecting these Phragmites in Rhode Island, in Barrington. It was a lot of fun. And then Aymar taught me how to use these materials in the way that they use Totora. So we made these floating devices that that today we installed in the boat that you can see in City Hall Plaza. So this is the other element of the presentation, right? So this Phragmites, the common reed, has also played an important role in places like Mexico for specific traditions that have to do with pyrotechnics, right? Why is that? Because they use, so some of them are the Judas burning traditions, like this one, where there's some character that embodies evil or embodies harm or embodies the traitor as Judas was, right? And it needs to be burnt in effigy, right? So this is a traditional one with horns. But then there are also other traditions like the pyrotechnic toritos, which are like bulls, as you can see it in the back. And these spectacles are really, really, really spectacular, right? And then the other tradition that I'm very, I really like talking about it is the pyrotechnic castillos, which is these big structures with pyrotechnics. And so all of these structures, right, and all of these designs are made with Phragmites originally. Of course, they have incorporated new materials, but as you can see in this piece that I did with my collaborators in Tultepec for an exhibition, the heart, the structure of all these paper mache structures is made of reeds, right? Like this. So they're beautifully woven, and they have become part of the identity of these places, all together with pyrotechnics. And here, the pyrotechnics, I've been researching a lot about pyrotechnics, and pyrotechnics were introduced by Franciscan priests as a way of oppressing technique for the, they made these autos sacramentales, which are plays, Franciscan plays of conversion. So the same indigenous populations had to perform in this place, and they, fire and fireworks were used as oppression elements that symbolize hell and punishment. So in my work, I've been very keen on kind of overturning this use of pyrotechnics in the way that original populations have overturned it, right? Because it hasn't taken a lot of time for the pyrotechnics to become part of a liberatory or subversive tradition, right? So this is work that I've done collaboratively with people in Tultepec and other communities in Mexico and also in other parts of the continent. For example, this one is in Michoacan, and so we're burning in effigy rhinoceros that represents the rhinoceros from the police that actually came to this community and attacked them, right? So these are all representations of evil and harm that are burnt in effigy during communal rituals to get rid of evil. And all of these structures have a heart of Phragmites, right? So Phragmites and pyrotechnics are kind of inseparable in these traditions. This is a work I did with the Mexican community in Chicago. And this takes me to the project we already have here in City Hall. This is a render of the original project, and as you can see, we managed to make it quite, similar to the original proposal. So I've always worked like this. We do renders, we do engineering diagrams, and then with my team in Tultepec, with whom I've worked before, so we build the boat. This here you can see how the Phragmites that are sturdier, actually I will pass them around at some point if people want to see them. So here we have the Phragmites from Mexico and the Phragmites from New England. As you can, and you will see that they are so different according to me because of the weather conditions. So the ones in Mexico are much sturdier, so there can be structural, as you can see. So this is all woven with Phragmites in the workshop in Tultepec, and then it was brought to Boston and installed in City Hall a few days ago. Oh, there's no picture there, sorry. And this is Aymar and me finishing the installation with the local Phragmites added to the Phragmites from Mexico City. So hopefully you had a chance to actually experience the piece, and if you didn't have a chance, today is the first day that we have lights on it at night, so probably it's going to be like a very nice experience for, at least for me, and hopefully for everyone here. So thank you very much.
Wow, it's a. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So it's just an enormous pleasure to be here to talk with you and be part of this conversation. So as a biodiversity scientist, I'm interested in both the pattern and the processes that have given rise to species on our planet. And this is a painting by the Dutch master, Rachel Reich. And what I find most interesting about this painting, Still Life of Exotic Flowers on a Marble Ledge, painted in 1735, are what I call the botanical Easter eggs. So these are species that came from far abroad, quite a bit away from Rachel's canvas in Amsterdam. And there's a whole variety of them here, nearly 37 depicted on this canvas. So you have plants like this carrion flower from South Africa, this prickly pear from the Caribbean, and this blue passion flower from South America. And what excites me about this sort of thing is thinking about the distribution of species in space and time, and how pre-human factors shape those distributions of organisms, and how human ecologies during modern time shape those distributions. And of course, the ultimate goal for me is to build better models of biodiversity as a means to better protect nature. And so, what is biodiversity? This is the first thing I think of when I see paintings like those by Reich, and this is another by Jan Bruegel, the Noah's Ark. But biodiversity is simply the variety of life on Earth and all the natural patterns that it forms. So as a plant biodiversity scientist, I think about the species of plants that inhabit our planet. So we can think about species diversity here on the left-hand side. But we can also think about functional aspects of this diversity. So we can think about species that are trees, and those perform certain kinds of functions in ecosystems. Or we can think about sedges that make up salt marshes here on the East Coast. Or we can think about grasses that make up the great prairies throughout the Midwestern United States. We can also think about genetic diversity. So there's a whole variety of ways that biodiversity think about diversity, and that's measured differently. And the important thing to keep in mind is that biodiversity is still being discovered and described. So this is a really nice example that I like to provide to my students about begonias. And it turns out that in the 1800s, we knew that there were only 25 species of begonia. Fast forward to 1900, and there are over 500 species of begonia. And today, we know that there are over 2,000 species of begonia. So begonias occupy our temperate latitudes. Some of you may grow them in your gardens, but most of the diversity of begonia is in the tropics. And of course, one of the big concerns today is many species are being lost before they even have a name. And that is the first point of reference, the first point of study, and we call these gray extinctions. So pattern versus process, that's a central kind of factor in terms of what I think about. So what is the pattern? So this is a map showing the identities of thousands of species and their distributions. And what we can see in this pattern is that biodiversity is much lower in the polar regions of the world. So in places like northern North America and southern South America, biodiversity is much less than it is around the equator in tropical and subtropical regions. So this is a characteristic pattern of biodiversity. We call it the latitudinal species gradient. The other side of that same coin is the process. So how did that biodiversity arise? And so this is a case where these researchers focused on the Andes, one of the richest biodiverse regions of the world, to investigate process. And so what they identified is that it's mountain uplift the construction of mountains and the creation of small microhabitats and environments that help to drive speciation in these regions, creating spectacular diversity like what we find in the lupins in that part of the world. But again, pattern versus process. And so when I travel to a forest like this here in New England, I think about pattern and process. So I look out on this landscape and I see the autumnal colors, and I think about all the different species that are in that forest, their identities, their abundance. That's the pattern. And then I think about how those species, through their ecologies and their evolution, have been assembled over the last 12,000 years subsequent to glaciation, glaciers rolling away from our region. How were these communities of plants put together over these recent time periods? And some of the ongoing work in our lab is focused on climate change in plants. So we've utilized historical data sets, observational records from people like Henry David Thoreau in Concord and surrounding areas, and we've juxtaposed those records of flowering times with those from natural history collections, from Herbaria. And these capture a time and a place of biological activity. And we know now that plants flower in this region about 7 to 10 days earlier than they have in the past. But what I want to assert here is that art can also capture a time and a place of biological activity, and that art is an underutilized source of biodiversity data. And that gets back to some of the ongoing work, and I want to make this argument with a whole series of examples. So we can think about petroglyphs, those earliest documented evidence of ecosystems and megafauna that occupied large continental areas prior to and initially around the onset of human arrivals. This helps us establish biodiversity baselines. We can think about Roman coins that capture the first recorded plant extinction. These are the silphium plant that was used medicinally as an abortifacient. It's related to things like dill and carrot. And we can think about gyotaku, these beautiful ink rubbings of fish that document historical trends from the Edo period in how fisheries have changed through time. So getting back to Rachel Reich and this exhibit that is now at the Boston MFA, and this very high biodiverse painting. No one had ever done detailed accounts of the paintings in her art, right? And so I tackled, myself and my team tackled this very much in the way that a biodiversity scientist would. This is a forest on canvas. So we can identify those species, and that's largely owing to the artistry of Rachel Reich. So for example, we can identify that this blue passion flower is one from Brazil rather than one from the Caribbean because of the fussy little details in the flowers that were captured by Reich. And this is her in her studio, and you can see her here with a fresh bouquet. But she also relied on extraordinary documented works of plants from the various four corners of the world. And this is a depiction of the species diversity in several of her paintings that she painted through time, noting that this mid-career period was one when she was painting extraordinarily diverse paintings in terms of their species richness. This was also an extraordinary time of botanical discovery and exploration, and an effort that was led by the Swede Carl Linnaeus. And so we identified the species. We also then connected them to their geographic origins. And this is a map of the geographic origins of all these species. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they map nearly perfectly onto Dutch colonial territories. So this is very much a story about the botany of empire in recent time periods, the agency that Rachel Reich had. She never visited any of these sites outside of Amsterdam, She had quite a famous father and an extensive and influential social scientific network, but she was obviously inspired and privileged to have access to these incredible and incoming resources that came from abroad. They were returned by ship. They were kept alive with a whole infrastructure of greenhouses and staff that made that possible. And she, in many ways, introduced these unique and distinctive species to Western Europe for the first time for these many audiences. So this is the exhibit itself. This also took place in the context of scientific exploration and collecting. These are herbarium specimens from the Harvard University Herbaria. And so they're kind of in conversation with one another. But again, here we can understand and utilize art as a resource for biodiversity, thinking about how plants are moved, where they come from, and what are the kind of human ecological contexts for these interactions. This is also another a piece from the exhibit, and we feature additionally numerous exhibits from the Museum of Comparative Zoology. So she was primarily a botanical painter, but also painted insects, birds, lizards, and whatnot. So it's just a really wonderful kind of hybrid exhibit here that illustrates this point about art as an unexplored archive that documents biodiversity. And so I just leave you with a question, which is to encourage you to think about what clues are hiding in plain sight in your favorite artwork, and how might that connect to biodiversity or human ecology. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
First, we're going to have about a 20-minute discussion and then a 5-minute time for questions and answers. So I'd like to start to just say I have a new title for our conversation, which is called The Botany of Empire. Thank you, Charles. Do you have comments, questions for each other?
Well, I kind of wanted to add something in response to what you just said, which is something I missed from my presentation, which is like you're talking about art as a resource for biodiversity research, but art and craft has also been a way of controlling invasive species. Because what happens in Tultepec, which is where my collaborators are from, where all these effigies I've been working with the craft makers, pyrotechnicians, master pyrotechnician, and artists there, they use so much of these invasive reeds that they have eliminated it. So there's no more invasive reeds in Tultepec. So they actually need to go to other places in Mexico to harvest it, because they got rid of it, right? Because they use it so much. So I'm wondering, art also as a form of, I don't know how to say it, erasure of invasive species or something like that. So, which is something that, I don't know, for me it's kind of, it sounds like a metaphor, but it's actually an actual thing, So I just wanted to add that to the presentations.
I'll add that.
Is it on?
Oh. Yeah, that's probably it. I'll add on that I'm actually experiencing this a little bit myself. Keeping my caterpillar colonies alive is a constant search for these invasive plants. And I'm harvesting out increasingly large circles around the research building that I work in of the tree of heaven growing in the sidewalk cracks and the Japanese barberry. So maybe if people take up keeping hobby caterpillar colonies.
I've got a backyard. You can take them out of my backyard.
Yeah, wonderful, yes.
I actually have a comment and question to all of you. When I think about the intersection of the work that all of you are doing, I also think about kind of indigenous ways of knowing and how that falls in line with how we think about biodiversity and quote-unquote invasive species. I was talking with an elder and some community members about understanding what invasive means in a different way and thinking differently about that, because we have so many spaces where invasive species are in our landscape now, that they were asking me to think more critically about what can we learn from those invasive species in our landscape. What's missing? What is there now? And how can our understanding of the past inform our understanding of the future?
I mean, that's a really good question, right? Because, the totora, which is not reeds, right? The one in the Lake Titicaca, it has been used for over 3,000 years, right? And then there are traces of how it's not only growing now in the Lake Titicaca, but also in some islands in the Pacific, right? And they don't actually know if this was brought by humans or brought by birds, right? But they have also learned how to build boats with them, right? So I don't know, I mean, these are not invasive species, I mean, not in the Lake Titicaca. I don't know if they call them invasive species, it's just like migrant species. So I think, I don't know, I mean, there's something, I want to bring up this idea of, when is it invasive and when is it migrant?
I think one of the things that I'm mindful of when I think about invasive species, plants in particular, is that this is a continuum. Plants move around either with human assistance and have for potentially millennia. And with globalization, that is increasing. But I think what we tend to forget is that the majority of introductions of species from foreign lands are kind of failed attempts. In other words, the plants never become established. In some cases, they establish, but in low levels populations. It's very rare that plants rise to the status of being invasive. But it's also really difficult to identify when it does reach that status. You kind of know it when you see it, but how we define it is variable and can differ from one ecologist to the next. And in my work on invasives, we've tried to determine if there's some climatic associations. And there are to a degree, but I think what most invasive species biologists will tell you is that it's very, very difficult to predict what is going to become an invasive. And so thinking about forward projecting about what this looks like from a biological management standpoint is really very difficult. Yeah.
I also wonder if invasive is not the word we should be using. I think about your question of invasives and migrants, and I think about your work actually about what was your term that you used?
I use non-invasive exotics for things that are introduced and grow here, but like Charles just said, don't take over. So, most of the ornamental plants that you might have in your yard would be a good example of you're never going to go into the woods and find those. Those are non-invasive exotics.
Yeah, but I have to say that one of the things that really surprised me, I guess, at the beginning, of this research, was the language that was being used, in biological terms, right? Because the language, and I have highlighted it, just taking it from scientific texts, and is the language of colonialism, right? Invasive species, native species, not native species, the ones that colonize and thrive, the ones that don't manage to colonize and thrive. So I don't know, I'm also wondering, we wonder about this a lot, right? In terms of science, natural sciences, social sciences, right? How are these sciences complicit, right? Of not only of the language, but what the language implies, in terms of colonization. Because also, going back to your point, right? Contrary to, biology, when you cannot identify, certainly which is an invasive or a non-invasive species, I guess in terms of anthropology or sociology or just everyday life, it's very clear, right? Who is the invasive species and who's not. I don't know.
Yeah, and so with with my research, when I was going out to look at, when I showed those 7 families that I had, one of my big things was going out and finding, okay, what plants are actually out here doing damage to the environment? What is what's suppressing native biodiversity? Is something being taken away by the environment, from the environment by this plant? And so I really wanted to focus on plants where that is the case, where there were a number of plants where it was like, a good example of this, of one that I didn't focus on, which kind of straddles the line between that invasive exotic versus non-invasive exotic, is apple. It's a good example of, nobody really hates on apple trees, and they don't really take over our forests here, but they're definitely not native. But I decided not to include that because it's not really something that's doing any damage.
But also, for what I know, but you correct me if I'm wrong, like apples as we know them are also being genetically
I should
transformed,
be very clear.
right?
I'm talking about crab apples, sorry. Yeah, these are generally things that were brought over for their flowers, not for their fruit. Yeah, no, I wish I could be going through the forest and just eating apples.
One of the things that I would add is I can certainly understand and appreciate some of the language and the terminology that's used. I would say, just to speak on behalf of our field, there is a kind of a schism that exists within the field of ecology and invasive biology, which is that there's a group of scientists that believe that we should really care a lot about these distinctions and about invasive species. But there's another cohort that it's like, species have been moving around the planet well before humans, and this is just the natural world playing out its natural role, and so that's a tension that also exists within the community. I think one of the things that I find most fascinating about your choice of the reed grass, Phragmites australis, is that. And it's one of the exercises I teach my students is using collections to detect an invasion. So what's unique about the species is that it is one species, but it has native and invasive strains. So we usually think about it as like a single reproductive kind of unit with a more global distribution. So there's a native New England Phragmites, and there's an invasive Phragmites. And to even someone like me with a botanically trained eye, they really are difficult to distinguish from one another. There's a series of features, and they do occur in different ecologies, in different wetland environments, but it's a cryptic kind of invasion. And so I find that choice of this duality, where it's one species, but different kind of strains, some of which are invasive and some of which that are native, is really interesting.
Well, I have to say that the choice was not mine, right? The choice is because that's the materials that they use in these communities in Tultepec and other parts of Mexico to build the effigy. So that's kind of what made me research about it, right? And I'm even wondering, why do we have these ones? This is a quarter of Phragmites from Mexico, right? It's a quarter because it's so hard, it's so structural, right? So that's why we use these ones to build the structural part of the boat. But then we have these ones that we collected here, which you can see these are whole Phragmites, and they're kind of the same size of a quarter Phragmite from the other one. So I'm wondering if this means that some of them are invasive and some of them are not invasive, or if this just means that the weather affects them, right? And honestly, I've been trying to contact scientists both in Mexico and here that can answer that question, but I haven't been able. So I guess it kind of goes back to your question, right? That it's so difficult to know.
It's probably phenotypic variation.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I know is from practical terms, that I know that these ones here suffer a lot, as most of the people here do, or at least me, from the weather changes, right? So they freeze and then they get very fragile, and the ones in Mexico, they just thrive because it's very moderate climate, right? So they're all year round, kind of in the same temperature. So they just keep growing. But I don't know. That's my
Yeah, I mean, ecologists there's a type of experiment that looks at this sort of thing. It's called a reciprocal transplant experiment, where what they do is they take seeds from the plants in Mexico and Rhode Island, and they'd swap them into the different environments. And so if the ones from Mexico grow really big and strong in Rhode Island still, we know that that's something in their genome that's different. But if the ones from Mexico suddenly look like the ones from Rhode Island when they're growing in Rhode Island, we know that it's just some plasticity in their growth form and their ability to change. And so without doing that experiment, we have no idea, but that is definitely something that ecologists are always interested in looking at.
So we have a collaborative project there.
Yeah, exactly. You might have a hard time getting permission to plant Phragmites.
Yeah, that's right.
Could I ask the panel to speak really loud because the second half of the room can't hear anything? Even though it sounds loud here, we have the acoustics as well as the jackhammer. So the second half of the room doesn't hear much.
Sorry.
It's okay. We just keep it back there.
Thank you. I had a question. It seems to me that we know what an invasive quality is, or it's voracious, it's evil, it's brutal. And I'm just wondering, in the work that you're all doing, if there are parts of your process that start to broaden those definitions, or things that you've been working on that surprised you, that you started with assumptions, or you started with certain questions that evolved because of the hands-on or the observation work that you're doing.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to this, because part of that initial definition that you just gave, that they're voracious, that they take a lot of resources. A lot of my research is actually dedicated to trying to figure out why can they do that? You know, every plant is out here struggling, trying to get as many resources as it possibly can. What is it exactly about invasive plants that allows them to do that? And I kind of reject this idea that I see put forward in the research a lot, this idea that they're kind of just, in big quotes, just better plants. They're just better at getting the resources. And I've got this whole big part that I actually I cut from my talk today about kind of trying to work out and theorize some of the budgeting that invasive plants do, and trying to figure out, okay, are they just better, or are they able to, maybe skimp on defenses a little bit because the caterpillars that eat them aren't here? But it surprised me. You asked about something that surprised you. It surprised me how many, how much of the literature so far on exotic plant species, exotic invasives, just does say, like, yeah, they're kind of just better than the plants that we have here. They grow faster, they grow more aggressive, they reproduce more, and therefore they're taking over, and it was inevitable. And I think the story is probably a little bit more nuanced than that.
I can speak a little to my work, since you all didn't get to hear about what I do in my day job, which is working for a land conservation organization as a curator. Very odd place to live, but it's wonderful. I work for the Trustees of Reservations, which is the largest landowner in the state of Massachusetts and the oldest land conservation organization in the nation. And so, working as someone who's in the arts, who is a traditional maker myself, I live in this place that is thinking about invasives in a very different way. Because I'm from here, I'm native to this landscape, it is my homelands. And so, building on the kind of relationships that I have with my human kin, I also have relationships with my non-human kin. And so teaching land conservation organizations to think differently about our relationship to place and our relationships to everything that is around us has been eye-opening because of colonial pressures, because of museum institutions, because of old ways of knowing and thought processes. And so hearing all of the way that you all are working, both in the art fields and also in the kind of environmental science and ecology fields and activism that you're doing through this work is really exciting, because the work that I'm trying to do feels like it's nuanced and no one has understood it, and trying to teach people within a conservation lens about these ways of thinking has been both beautiful and a struggle. And to see more people doing that in other organizations is really exciting. And you as an artist also uplifting that same kind of conversation.
Have you guys got questions? It's time. I'm going to hand you the mic.
Can you? Yeah. Can you get close enough?
That's as far as you go. We can also repeat the question.
Here, I got it.
Okay.
I got it.
There you go.
Does climate change play any role in your ideas?
The question was, does climate change have a role in the ideas that you have?
So I can speak a little bit to that. We've done some work in New England and a bit outside of New England to look at how flowering time response, which is one of the best proxies we have for understanding how plants respond to climate, how they react in native, non-native, non-invasive, and invasive species. And there is a signal which suggests that non-natives and invasives especially are very adept at adjusting their time of flowering to temperature. And so that there may be a climate change association with the ability of being an invasive. That's not uniformly identified across all areas, but in the work we've done, there's signal. The great challenge is that to use this in a predictive way, you have to have long-term ecological data, or the kind of experimental data that Michael was alluding to for large numbers of species. And we often don't have that kind of fussy, fine-scale information for the many plants that inhabit the planet. So it's very difficult to build more of a predictive science around that. But there certainly are instances where it's the case that some species tend to better respond to climate. And we do know that some of these responses will evolve over very short time periods. So the purple loosestrife that Michael mentioned has been able to expand its range northward by reducing its stature, but also adjusting its flowering time to more northern, colder climates.
Yeah, actually, I have a follow-up related to the climate change thing. So, in your, you have a geographic map shows when the north on the pole areas has a less diversity, and the middle part is increased the diversity. So, with the climate change, once especially it's warming, do you expect the diversity start to move towards the pole to increase a little bit? And the second question is, once it's too hot, does the middle band actually become less diverse, possibly?
So with one of the most fundamental responses that plants and other organisms show to climate change is what's called a poleward push. So they're pushing to northern cooler or southern cooler latitudes. And we're seeing that already among many of the plants that occupy New England. So there's very much a strong signature of that. In the tropics, it's a little bit more difficult, but from the research that I know and understand in parts of the Amazon, there are areas of the eastern flanks of the Amazon that are now drying up as a result of climate change associations in those regions. They're becoming much more like savannas than ever wet tropical forest.
Hi, I have a question about this idea of the invasive species being a problem, right? And so if you think about one of the world's most recent land masses, right, is, the Galapagos Islands, right? They were barren for a long time. And it was basically invasive species that largely came from South America and the South Pacific that populated that area, as well as animals. So without this transfer of species, right, we wouldn't have, they would just be barren rocks still today. So, and then here's the idea of the problem, right? So how much of it is it really a problem for the environment versus a problem for this concept of empire, right? Human activity. Because a lot of times there's a difference. Is it really a problem for the environment, or is it just really mainly a problem for the environment, for the farmers or the lobstermen or the lumber companies?
I can respond a little bit to that and kind of clap back a little. What's the problem with a barren landscape? What's the problem with a landscape that doesn't have those plants on it? What's the problem with it being what it used to be historically? Humans have a problem with not intervening with the land. They don't understand that sometimes it's okay for it to stay the way it was. And I realize that in some of the work that we're doing, we're trying to get back to that, but also, I don't know, think a little bit on that, because there's not a problem with the land being barren. Maybe that is the way that landscape was intended to be. Maybe that's the way the landscape has always been. We have oral histories that tell us of those kinds of things in our indigenous communities. So what's wrong with that?
And I will add an example that doesn't have to do with plants, but with animals, actually. So I've been doing this new project that is about the mapana, which is a serpent, right? So it's a highly venomous serpent, very, very venomous. So it exists basically from Colombia to the south of Mexico, right? And because of the fear, right, that has been like kind of instilled into the populations, right? So whenever people see a serpent, it doesn't matter if it's a mapana or not, they just kill it, right? And this is people from campesino communities, right? But when they kill all of the serpents that are around them, so they kind of, they hurt the chain, right? And so they automatically become affected by their own actions, right? Because their harvests, their crops, then get infested by, for example, rats, right? So then the serpents that are the main, what's the name? The predator for the rats are no longer there, right? But it's just, and this has been, instilled by Western thought, because in pre-Hispanic times and even in indigenous communities from the area, the serpent is a sacred animal, right? So you would never kill a serpent, right? And if you even go back to the Mexican identity, right? So then you find that the serpent that's being eaten by the eagle in the lake is our symbol, right? It's in our flag, and it's how Tenochtitlan was actually, established. So it's like, what happened? What's the rupture, that happened, that suddenly you're not looking for the serpent as a sacred animal, but you're looking to kill it whenever you find it, right? Just for the sake of fear. So, I don't know, this project is about the roots of fear, so I'm still developing it, but I think it also kind of relates to your question.
I'll just add that I think what you're reflecting is the tension that I mentioned earlier within the field of ecology, which is the viewpoint that, species originate in places and they move around on landscapes, and they've done that since the history of life on Earth. Why should this moment be any different? And the flip side of that is that we're moving things around humans, one species that inhabits this planet at an unprecedented and arguably alarming rate, either intentionally or unintentionally. And the world is just shrinking. And what that means is that, the biotic distinctiveness of regions is being flattened. It's being homogenized. And so, the iconic floras of the world, like the Himalayas and the Andes, they become less unique at some level, and biodiversity changes. And what that means is a bit uncertain. And this is what people like Michael and I spend careers trying to sort out. How and why does that matter? And hopefully the science can actually emerge with policies that help to make better decisions about how to handle these sorts of scenarios.
This was, I hate to cut you off.
I'd really like to say something.
Okay. Because
I just wanted to give a quick experience of Lake Titicaca since my ancestors were on the screen there. My traditional community speaks an indigenous language, and we've suffered a lot of misunderstanding by a government, and science through government maybe is different than studious people such as yourselves who maybe are open to hearing different ways, but there's so much traditional knowledge. And then the idea of conservation, and it probably exists in the United States too, where there's like one version of conservation, which is the human is bad, don't let them near your nature. And then there's the indigenous point of view, which is, the human is a part of and belongs to the nature, not the other way around. So there's a big disconnect. Like, we've had to defend our Totora reeds many times because we actually planted those reeds and used them for resources for our food, for the livestock, and for roofs and the boats you saw. And the government will try to mow you down. No, now you are in a nature preserve, and therefore your knowledge and time with these species are no longer valuable because the science says you just have to completely leave it alone and not touch it. And so one big conflict was in the dry season, we burn the Totora and it grows back green and it gets rid of things, and not a complete burn, but in certain areas. And they're saying, no, don't burn at all. So that's one point of conflict. And then the other point of conflict I've watched happen over the years is a traditional duck hunt where people would be controlled and not go into hunt until a certain time of year and only take a certain amount, and they'd come in and say, you are hereby criminally prohibited from doing this anymore. And it creates a moment of loss of traditions and customs that were actually in tune with nature. And then people move to the city and it creates a chain of like degradation of the human interaction with the nature amongst Native communities also. I just really needed to add that. Thank you.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Yeah, and there's also another example from Peru that I noticed, right? That the terraces that the Quechua built to actually, have crops and harvest. So at some point they were like, okay, these ones are archaeological sites, right? So you cannot harvest them anymore. You cannot grow crops anymore because we need to preserve them. And what happened? The preservation just eroded them, because if you don't use them, then they erode, right? So it's kind of like, as you were saying, hopefully at some point science and policies actually like look at the ancient knowledge and also look at the scientific knowledge, all together.
I'm going to stop us because there's an opportunity for people to gather, and Margarita's going to tell us where because I can't remember. But I want to say thank you to the participants. I'm deeply moved by the depth of your research and your thoughts and your commitments, and so much sadness that comes with the work you're doing, with the hope that as we all understand more, that we're not going to let some of these really destructive things happen. It's a different kind of invasion, I know. But thank you all for coming. Thank you to Triennial for collaborating with Catalyst Conversations. Thank you, presenters. Thank you, Tess.
First of all, I also thank all of you and audience, all of you for being